My name is Sila Barr. I'm the Assistant Director of the Middle East Studies program here at UW. I'm excited to introduce Unifier Dyer. So please pardon any mispronunciations I may make. Unifier Dyer is a healer, Maine Isa Ngoma, educator, and racial justice practitioner. They are a doctoral candidate in the Department of African Cultural Studies at UW-Madison, with research focused on the healer and healing in African and African diasporic women's post-colonial novels, biomythographies, and speculative fiction. Unifier Dyer is a co-editor of Ubuntu and the Everyday, Africa World Press 2019, with James Agude, and has published on Afrofeminist contributions to Ubuntu. So please join us in welcoming Unifier to our workshop.
Thank you, Sela, for that kind introduction. And, thank you to the organizers of this conference, this workshop, this day. I wonder if anyone has had any opportunity to stretch or stand up. I know it's been a long day, so thank you all for being here. I know you had probably a long morning, a full afternoon, so thank you for making it here. If anyone would like to, who's on or off screen, would just like to stretch, stand. I would have stood, but I actually stood for the last talk. And now I've sat down just because I've had to plug something in, but please feel free to move your bodies a bit because we sit for quite a long time. I will, as everyone kind of moves their body, I will add to that lovely introduction that I am the daughter of Clive and Manalo. I am the granddaughter of Mihloti, Tizirondi, Jack, and Hazel. I am the great-granddaughter of Paulosi, Elizabeth, Ruth, there go my ancestors. So I kind of introduced myself in this way to open up space for everyone who's here to use the chat box to introduce yourself, thinking of your relations. One of the things that comes up for me, kind of situated on Ho Chunk land right now in the summer, is how there's so much more of an intimate relationship with plants. I have just behind me the Edna Taylor Park. So seeing rabbits, seeing butterflies, seeing birds, seeing flowers, at all times of the day. Those are things that kind of really stay on my mind right now. These are the kind of expansive relations that we will be sort of getting into today. And if everyone could, go in and introduce themselves. I know it's late in the day to do introductions, but there's a real necessity when thinking of the concept that I'm going to be talking about today, to initiate greetings. And greetings can happen any time of the day. And I would love for everyone to also include one important relation. I'll share screen so that I can offer you that prompt on screen. And then I will also share this introduction prompt in the chat here, while I also share screen. So please introduce yourself and name a close relation of yours. They can but need not necessarily be human-to-human relations. And I say relations plurally because it might be more than one relation that you want to share. Bear with me as all right. Hi, Essie. Hi, Sarah. Hi, Carrie. Hi, Andrea.
And it looks like when you're sharing your screen, we're seeing the presenter mode. Sorry, we're not seeing the presenter mode. We're seeing your notes, but not the presentation. So if you have more than one screen, that might be impacting it.
Okay, I will. Does that work?
Yes.
Great. Thank you all, and thank you for bringing your loved ones in here. I think that it's really important that we know that we're always with our relations, wherever we are, wherever we go. And today we'll be exploring that. I've really made some assumptions in this kind of exploration that we'll go into on Ubuntu and the expansiveness of relational responsibilities. And one of them is that you're familiar with the African map, you know, and the kind of different regions that are there. And we'll, I haven't made this assumption, but we will be going into a few languages, mainly Southern African languages. So you will hear a lot of different language, which I have translated in some places. So the way in which I would like us to sort of move today together is to have me situate Ubuntu for us all as a relational indigenous philosophy. And part of that is, you know, we'll be going into some of the political, the social, cultural, the linguistic aspects of it. And then we'll move into maybe something a bit different today. So a journal prompt. If you've been taking notes, then you can take them, you know, in the same notebook that you have. If you'd like to, you know, grab your pen or pencil or sketchbook, I encourage doodling as well, and drawing, sketching, you know, for the journal prompt. This is something that I love using for workshops, but I'm also starting to bring into my teaching. So if it's something that, you know, is worthwhile for you, I find that journal prompts allow for a learning that brings relation into what one is studying. And then we'll go into breakout rooms where we'll do some reflective discussion on the journal prompts that we've written. And I'll depend on everyone here for, I think it's Essie technically, to assist with those breakout rooms. More than 3, hopefully, in a group. I think we're enough for that. I think we could even be like 5 in a group. That would work quite well. And then we'll regroup and have, you know, probably quite a short but a larger discussion reflecting the time that we've had in the breakout sessions. So I don't know how many people here have heard of the concept of Ubuntu. It's actually gaining quite a lot of traction in the US. You have things like Ubuntu Village, you have curricular schools that are built on Ubuntu. You have conferences that have been coming up on Ubuntu. Some of them in the US, some of them in collaboration between US institutions and South African institutions, for instance. So it's a term that is a indigenous philosophy of relationality, and it's oftentimes connected with South Africa because Ubuntu is a Nguni term or concept. And so the language situates it within South Africa. However, you find the concept in Southern Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, and you could think of it as connected to concepts like Buen Vivir, which you heard of today, Ho'oponopo from Hawaii, also indigenous Australian concepts of being and well-being. So there is something that is useful in knowing that indigenous concepts and philosophies have foundational similarities of relationality, of interconnectedness. And this is something that you find too in Ubuntu. Ubuntu, I think it's important to know that it's entangled within histories because it is an indigenous philosophy that has been there over time. And so it is entangled in histories of, on the continent, slavery, colonialism, in South Africa, apartheid, and then in post-apartheid South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is set up between 1994 and 1996 by President Nelson Mandela and led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu as a way to reconcile relations between white apartheid perpetrators of gross human violences and the larger Black population who were tortured, murdered, exiled. So there is a way in which Ubuntu is appropriated and used for reconciliation post-apartheid. And that defines a lot of the post-apartheid and present-day discussions and research on Ubuntu. Ubuntu is also, I mean, the word itself lets you know that it's linguistically situated, and it's situated within African thought, practice, and philosophies. So even if you're thinking of Ubuntu in the South African context, if you're thinking of its variant in Zimbabwe, Hunu, or its variant on the Swahili coast, Utu, those are all linguistically situated within their context. And oftentimes the way that we find that is in proverbs and maxims. And we will discuss we'll go into some of those a bit later. Ubuntu is a praxis by Umuntu, and Umuntu is person. It's the word for person. And it is constantly being assessed, embodied, re-emphasized. It's a relational philosophy that requires us to assess how we engage with one another constantly. And there are principles and foundations that our relationality is premised on. And so those are constantly being reassessed. They're embodied because we practice them, and they constantly have to be re-emphasized. Ubuntu is embedded within isintu, and isintu is performance, and performance, for instance, of oral poetry, folklore, rituals, and decorum. So the way in which we are supposed to hold ourselves in ritual. It's also interconnection. It is how we are connected, not just to each other as humans, but to those who have come before us and to those who are yet to come. And the way in which we relate with each other as living beings has a great impact on how those who are living will relate to us in our form as ancestors. And the way in which we relate to each other now informs how those who are to come into this world are expected to relate with one another. So I brought up the word Ubuntu, person, and I'd like us to delve a bit into who or what Ubuntu is, since Ubuntu is linguistically situated. And Ubuntu, or the person, is a relational being. They are always seen in relation to abantu, or to people. And so in many instances, this has begged the philosophical question of, who is a person? Who is named a person or not a person? And later on, we'll go into a bit of, in terms of Ubuntu, why that becomes so necessary. I did mention earlier, the context of apartheid in South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And those are very important in terms of the kind of discussions that come up around who is a person and who is not a person, who can be dehumanized and who is offered, full personhood. Those are questions that come up quite a lot in conversations on Ubuntu. Ubuntu, or the person, is also part of a continuum. They are part of kin, so not just close relations here as in your family, but your larger community, right? Ancestors, who I've spoken a bit about, the unborn, and certainly your environment, because of the way in which interconnection allows for a continuum. And then there is the need to pay attention to the root word untu, which if you've been noting in everything I've been saying, is always at the end, right? I mentioned utu, ubuntu, muntu, isintu. So that root word, that prefix is very important because it connects the person to the larger complex, but it also speaks of a changing being. If we're speaking of a continuum, then we're speaking of a being that constantly changes. We are part of our ancestors. We are here because of our ancestors, but we're not exactly them. We're a continuum of them. And what is to come after us is a continuum of us and what has come before us. So that Ubuntu refers to the changing state of being, which is why Ubuntu constantly needs to be embodied and re-emphasized and reassessed, because we are changeful beings. And it also allows us to realize that even as time goes on and even as history plays out, Ubuntu remains relevant to its time and to each time in which we call upon it. Another term I spoke of earlier is isintu, or decorum. And isintu is really situated within a people's customs, a people's way of being. And we find isintu within the way people perform. Praise poetry is extremely important, for instance, in Nguni culture. It is a way of documenting genealogy, of speaking to current affairs, of commentary on the state of being, the state of a nation, the state of a people, the state of a community. Folk tales are extremely important for passing down histories. and also lessons for how we should be, moral principles. Isintu is also related to the rituals. There is a ritual called Ubuntu, and Ubuntu is the ritual of a ritual that is performed 1 year after someone has passed. And what that ritual does is allow space from the time of passing and the funeral where tears are shed to a year after, where the person's spirit is re-welcomed, is greeted and re-welcomed into the community as an ancestor. So within Ubuntu is the umbrella of isintu, and within isintu are these rituals that are upheld to continue the relations that we have with those who may not be with us. Isintu is also embedded in embodiment, and one place in which embodiment becomes really important is not so much in the earlier conversations on Ubuntu within, for instance, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but the conversations that are happening now around ecofeminism, for instance, how we relate not just to patriarchy, right, but and systems of violence, but how we relate to our environment, how we break cycles of patriarchy through more interconnected relations rather than separations. There is also the idea of Utu feminism, which is a way of practicing and combining Ubuntu or Utu. Utu is just a variant of Ubuntu from the Swahili coast. So merging Utu or Ubuntu with feminist practice and allowing the two to coexist. And what this also does is it attends to one of the critiques on Ubuntu, that Ubuntu is situated within a patriarchal structure, and it exists within that. In fact, it in post-apartheid South Africa sometimes thrives on that in a state where we have, for instance, femicide, a real crisis on femicide. And that embodiment also speaks to the sacred, right? We can think of the sacred in terms of what I said on the ritual of Ukubuiswa. So these are the ways in which isintu is embodied. So Ubuntu exists within the cyclical worldview, and I find that this diagram really assists us to understand the ways in which the being as a continuum can be expressed, but also the relations between the spirit world, where we have the gods, the lesser gods and goddesses, oracles and ancestors, the physical world where, for instance, there are queens, titled men, warriors, workers, humans and spiritual slaves, useless people. This diagram is within the context of Igbo cosmology. And so it's not a universal diagram on how to think of Ubuntu. In fact, it's much more useful to think of it in terms of how the interconnectedness works, and it will be different in different areas. And then in the middle, we have the priests, priestesses, diviners, and spirit mediums, those who facilitate the relation between the spirit world and the physical world. And they will perform the rituals within isintu. I find that this image of the photographer Fabrice Monteiro is really useful to think about this interconnectedness in this day and age. So this is an image of a jinn, a spirit figure. So a jinn is a spirit. And this is within the Senegalese context. And you can see how large this figure is, right? This idea that it is a larger than human, a greater than human being. But it is very intertwined in our present realities, in a world where we have mass consumption, in a world where we, are very prone to polluting. And this jinn, a figure that usually one would think would associate spirits to nature, right? This figure is squarely located within the crisis of pollution. And yet they reach out, and it's almost as if they reach out to humanity and make the statement of what state we're in. So I find that this image helps me always to speak to the connection between how we choose to relate, and that the way that we choose to relate is always going to have an effect on something else. Now, when it comes to Ubuntu, context always matters. The way in which we speak about Ubuntu cannot be divorced from the political. And a lot of literature on Ubuntu thinks of Ubuntu as something that comes in once there is crisis. Once there is a crisis of relation, once there is a crisis of being, once there's a crisis within society, Ubuntu is there as this mediator, as a way of setting out a path for how we ought to relate to one another as humane beings. And so the spaces in which it has appeared in this crisis mode is for early Black intellectuals in South Africa who, under colonialism, were thinking about alternatives to the colonial structure that were embedded in African or Bantu cosmology and thinking. It found its way, for instance, in Black consciousness from Stephen Biko in South Africa, through the idea of Pan-Africanism, because there are instances throughout the continent where ideas such as Ujamaa in Tanzania by Julius Nyerere, the first president there, Leopold Senghor's idea of negritude in Senegal, Kwame Nkrumah's idea of conscientism. These are all rooted within philosophies that have relation to and thinking that is around how we relate, around communitarianism. And that becomes very important when thinking about the way in which they draw upon concepts and ideas that have a relation to Ubuntu. We spoke earlier about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its relevance within the relevance of Ubuntu as a reconciliatory mediator. And then in post-apartheid South Africa. And Ubuntu is also, cannot be divorced from its social cultural context. Although it's seen in crisis, it's actually a practice that people use at the everyday level. We are relating with one another all the time, every day. We do not relate with one another only once we are in crisis. And so it's an important philosophy in everyday practice. It speaks to our expansiveness of being, and it speaks again to the concept of the person who is not assumed, but has to earn their place in society through their actions and deeds. And then, of course, Ubuntu is linguistically situated. It's a worldview, and sometimes, linguistically, it has some mistranslations. And so I'll go quickly into a greeting as a way of showing how Ubuntu, is embedded within language. So in isiZulu, people say sawubona, and the respondent says sawubona, and the first speaker says ninjani. And sawubona, it says, I see you. Sawubona says, I acknowledge you. I am aware of your presence. And in being aware of someone's presence, it assumes that that person is being seen in plurality, that they are being seen with their relations. And Ninjani asks after one's well-being. So this is how Ubuntu, in greeting and linguistically, connects one to questions of well-being. And those questions of well-being are always situated in plurality and not the singular individual. The respondent would say ngisaphila. So if I say sawubona and you say sawubona, and I say ninjani and you say ngisaphila, ngisaphila literally says I am living, I am alive. It remarks on one state of living, and it's always followed by an update on how relations are doing, on the effect of the environment and larger societal issues. So just in greeting, we find that there is a call for interconnectedness. Greetings situate one within relations that are as close to the self, that are about other abantu, and that are about the more than human, one's larger society and the state of the environment. I won't go through all of these, but I will speak to the first one. This maxim, which is the most popular. So if you do any research on Ubuntu, any paper, any book, anything on Ubuntu, you will find the maxim, umuntu ngabantu. It's a Nguni maxim. And umuntu meaning the person or people, ngu referring to becomes part of, muntu, the productive agent or the performer, nga, right, the second nga, through contribution, bantu, right, meaning the community or people. So one is who they are through their act or performance as a contribution to society and their community. So you are through your contribution to society. All of these other maxims are also speaking to the way in which we are reliant on community, and how leadership is similarly situated in that way. The way in which strangers are thought of, right? Not as needing to be feared, or as those who we should distance ourselves from, but as those who we should invite. And then, of course, a maxim, I'm just putting this maxim out there, not to romanticize Ubuntu, because Ubuntu is not about, it's not a kumbaya philosophy. It is, like I mentioned earlier, it is often used in crisis, and it is something that is used in the everyday too. So I'd like us now to move into something that allows us to reflect a bit on our own context. Earlier I said that context matters, but your own context matters too. And I'd love for us to spend some time, we'll have two prompts. This first one, I'll be asking us to think of thinking of our positionality, and I think it's important when thinking of Ubuntu to know that it's a concept that is situated on the African continent, but we, respectfully can engage with it and its principles without appropriating it. But it allows us to think about our relations and what our stories or histories or her stories are with disharmony. So I'd love for us, collectively to, in this larger space, spend 3 minutes just journaling on this prompt, and then we'll move on to the next prompt. And I'll just stop my share here and I'll insert this prompt in the chat. Okay, so our second prompt, and I do want everyone to know, just a reminder again, that it can be in drawing form. You need not, or doodle. I think that we all can express ourselves in the ways that we feel most comfortable with. The second journal prompt is to return to your initial relations, and if you can, add more relations. And furthermore, how do you tend to your close relations? And I put the asterisk on the last one. How do you tend to your more expansive relations, as something you can write now or write later? Because I think that the way we tend to our relations and thinking about it and writing about it can be things that we do, more than just once off. There are ways in which that allows us to reassess them and to strengthen them, and to see, what their state is. So I'll again stop share just so that I can share the music with you again, and I'll add this prompt in the chat box. Welcome back, everyone. It was nice to see some people's face briefly. Thank you all for participating, and I would love for anyone who'd like to share what came up either in their writing or in the breakout sessions or post breakout sessions, what's kind of coming up, or any questions for the next 2 minutes. Also, please feel welcome to put the questions in the chat. I see there's a question on the music that I was playing. So I got it on Spotify, and there's an album there called Water Falling 432 Hertz. I'll just put it there. And 432 Hertz is known as the frequency of the heavenly. It's a frequency of compassion. So Christina, would you like to share, since you weren't able to do much sharing in the breakout group? So there's a question here by Omid. Could you please give an example of disharmony for the first prompt? So if we're thinking of disharmony, then, we're thinking of relations that have tension, histories of ours of conflict, of crisis. It can be a past one. It can be a present one. It can even be a future one. But disharmony is something that we naturally feel. It's something that is we can wake up feeling. We can feel because we've had an argument with someone. We can feel because we've read something in the news. We've watched something that makes us feel disconnected. Something that makes us feel ill at ease. And I think all of us have those stories, but they're not the beginning and the end of us. And the reason why Ubuntu is there is because there is a recognition that that disharmony exists, and that our relations are there for us to repair that disharmony. All right, there's so Essie says, you mentioned at the start of your talk that Ubuntu was used in the peace and reconciliation process, and it sounded like you have criticism of that process or the use of Ubuntu in it. Can you say more about it? Absolutely. The Ubuntu was used within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, specifically by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and he popularized the maxim that I spoke of, Ubuntu abantu. But there, post Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a lot of people felt that Ubuntu was being prematurely used as a glue to stick a nation that was in great pain, and a nation that actually required those who had done harm to realize that they had acted in inhumane ways before they could be offered forgiveness by those who they still saw as, less than human. So I think part of the criticism around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that Ubuntu is used in a moment of deep need for healing. However, it doesn't take into consideration who is having to carry the burden of the healing, right? The majority of Black people in South Africa who are required to extend forgiveness to those who have perpetrated heinous crimes, yet they don't see the larger population as human yet. So that is what the greatest critique on Ubuntu has been. However, it's not a negation of Ubuntu. It's a need for people to recognize that they need to rethink what being a human means within the context of the harm that they have created, and that in order to be forgiven, you need to show that you wish to reconcile, that you wish to work towards harmony. So yeah, thank you for that question. I'm not sure if I can take this last question. I think I'll have to ask from facilitators.
Yeah, I think we have time for one last question.
Okay. So Eleanor says, this is a question from an earlier slide, but what does it mean that the belly of the traveler is as big as a bird? Can you talk more about the saying? Yes, thanks for bringing that up. The idea is that if someone has come and they have need, and you have, how great is their need that you can't give them something of yours? So if you equate a person's need to the belly of a bird, right, to like the belly of a stranger to a bird, I mean, you can see how small a bird is compared to us. The idea is that if someone comes and they need help, how great is their help that you can't assist them with something that you have? Can you take someone's need as something that isn't a inconvenience to you, right? As something that you can welcome? So if you were imagining that, you were feeding someone hungry who had a belly the size of a bird, that'd be very little that you'd have to give them. So it's an extension for you to be generous, is really what it is. Thank you for that question.
Well, I think we'll need to, this is the end of your presentation. I want, if we can thank everyone for Unifier's fascinating talk. Thank you so much. The concept of the individual that you've presented is really fascinating, how interconnected they are. So thank you.
Thank you very much.